I'd like to welcome everyone to this evening's Church in the 21st Century event, Analysis of a Scandal, Psychosocial Roots of the Sexual Abuse Scandal, sponsored by the Graduate School of Social Work here at Boston College. My name is Lynne Sanford, and I am a part of the subcommittee on the Church in the 21st Century in the Social Work School. And we are very excited this evening to provide a platform for our speaker, Dr. Mary Gail Frawley-O'Day. I would like to especially thank Paul Kellen from the Winchester Voice of the Faithful. Where is Paul? He was the person who let us know about Dr. Frawley-O'Day and put us in contact with her. So I'd like to really thank him. I'd also like to thank the Social Work Subcommittee that included Paul Collins, Lynne Sanford, John McNutt, Bob Castagnola, Chuck Morin, Vince Lynch, Dick Rowland, Sister Mary Domingo, Linda Doucette, and Hugo Camia, who have worked on different lectures and events throughout the year. I'd also like to call your attention to a flyer that's on the table outside. These are upcoming events that the Social Work School is sponsoring that are specifically for clinicians around continuing ed workshops, and they're related to the topics that we're speaking about this evening. So if people are looking for continuing ed units, you can pick up one of those flyers on the way out. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Lynne Sanford, who is a lecturer here at the Graduate School of Social Work and an expert on sexual abuse and trauma in her own right.
Welcome. I'd also like to thank the Winchester Voice of the Faithful, and also thank Bob Newton, who's here. Bob, would you like to just raise your hand? From the Church of the 21st Century from Boston College. We're very lucky here at Boston College because our president, Father Leahy, has shown a tremendous amount of courage and has allowed not just the church in the 21st century to flourish, but other organizations use our space. And Bob has been the person who has helped us get so many of these things going. So it's my pleasure to introduce Mary Gail Frawley-O'Day, and I'd like to do that and give her all the time that she needs to talk. She is the co-author of a classic book. It is called Treating the Adult Survivor of Sexual Abuse. It's a book she wrote in 1994 with Jody Davies. And on just a personal note, this book, I think, did a lot of good in many ways. They had a specific concept they called pathological regression. This was during the time when a lot of people thought therapy was benign for survivors of abuse, that any therapy was good, and that the point of therapy should be to get the memories up and out and to have a cathartic experience. And they pointed out that that could actually be somewhat harmful for people. And I think that they brought a lot of clarity and reason to the field. So you'll see this is not the first time that Dr. Frawley-O'Day has stood up to dominant culture kinds of issues. She's currently the executive director of the Trauma Treatment Center in New York City and is co-director of the Manhattan Institute for Psychoanalysis. In June of 2002, she was an invited speaker at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops meeting in Dallas, and she's continued to volunteer her time and her expertise to many religious orders who are truly interested in the process of truth and reconciliation. She was one of 80 mental health professionals who signed a letter to Bishop Lennon asking him to stop deposing the clinicians who were treating the survivors of sexual abuse by clergy. And after that letter was sent, she was particularly helpful as an inside outsider through a series of emails to help explain to the survivors and to empower them to fight back against these subpoenas. So with no further ado, I'd like to welcome to Boston College, a Jesuit institution, Dr. Mary Gail Frawley-O'Day. Yeah.
That's great. Can you hear me? Okay, good. First of all, I just want to say what a pleasure. Now, I really don't want to hold it, but if I have to, I will.
Why don't you move your foot, and I'll just move it in a little bit more. Okay, now put your foot on the other side.
Okay, how's that? First of all, I just want to say what a pleasure it is for me to be presenting in Massachusetts. I've been a clinical psychologist now for about 15, 16 years, and it's been very seldom that I've had the opportunity to come home to present. I grew up in Chelmsford, went to the Academy of Notre Dame in Tingsboro, and went for my first 2 years of college to Emmanuel College. So and there's family and friends in the audience, which is both just wonderful and more anxiety-provoking than any professional audience that I could come up with. In addition to having a number of family and friends that were educated by the Jesuits at BC and Holy Cross and Georgetown, I've also spent a number of very rewarding days this year with various Jesuit communities in the New York province. The Jesuits, along with the Benedictine monks at St. John's Abbey in Minnesota, have responded to sexual abuse charges against their brothers in pastoral ways that should be examples to the rest of the church, but unfortunately have not been in most cases. Since addressing the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops in June last year and the annual assembly of the Conference of Major Superiors of Men last August in Philadelphia, I've become increasingly involved in reading, thinking, and writing about the psychosocial underpinnings of the current sexual abuse scandal. And what I mean by the sexual abuse scandal is not the sexual abuse itself. That can happen and will happen anywhere. Rather, I refer here to the decades, if not centuries, of dishonesty, deceit, and devaluation of victims enacted by various constituencies within the Church that constituted the massive cover-up of sexually predatory behavior by priests and vowed religious against children, adolescents, adult religious women, and adult parishioners. Although there has been an understandable effort to identify one or just a few causes of the scandal, I believe that every constituency within the Church, the Pope, Vatican officials, cardinals and bishops, rank-and-file priests, abusing priests, religious women, church employees, and other laity all share various degrees of accountability for the cover-up. In order to fully understand the genesis and sustenance of the cover-up, then, one must unpack complicated, multiply layered, and interdependent strands of teachings and traditions from which the cover-up of sexual abuse predictably evolved. It is beyond the scope of one evening's talk to do more than begin to examine a few threads of the tapestry of cover-up. My book, to be published by Vanderbilt University Press sometime in 2004, will follow the rest of the trail. But tonight I will focus on the hierarchy to try to explicate some of the psychosocial roots of their utter failure to respond pastorally to the crisis. Before turning to that topic, however, we need to remember why we are here. As elegant and intellectually interesting paradigms are constructed by me and others to unpack the ideological roots of the sexual abuse scandal in this church, it is easy to lose track of the phenomenology of sexual abuse and what it does to the souls of victims. Let us begin, therefore, with a true crime story, a story told in my consultation room by a 30-something-year-old man. As I relate his narrative, I want you to try to imagine yourselves as him. I want you to listen more with your bodies, guts, and emotions than with your heads, so that you can experience the rest of my talk with your souls as much as with your intellects, so that you can try to connect with the victims tonight more than with anyone else involved in the crisis. Imagine then that you are 8 years old and have just become an altar boy. Your parents, struggling with marital problems and alcoholism, are not very available to you. So you are especially proud to have a place in the family of your parish. It's a cold, bright February Sunday, and you have just finished helping Father Bill, your favorite priest, serve Mass. As you enter the sacristy, Father Bill tells you that you did a great job at this last Mass of the morning, and you can feel the pride and happiness filling you up. The priest, your priest, offers to help you pull the cassock over your head, joking that he still can't get used to wearing dresses. But as Father Bill lifts the cassock up, he holds it over your face with one hand, unzips his trousers with the other, and pushes his erect penis into your back. You sense him moving back and forth against you. Blindfolded by the cassock, you can only stand still until, after moaning and leaning into you one more time, Father Bill loosens his grip. You feel moisture on your back, but as he pulls the cassock all the way off, he is wiping your back with a towel and mumbling about the steam radiator making you sweaty. He pats you on the back and tells you to turn off the lights before you leave for the day. Not a word is said about what just happened. What did just happen, you wonder? You feel funny, scared, but not really sure if you have any reason to be. It's Father Bill, after all, your favorite priest. Can you imagine? For the next 3 years, Father Bill repeats these acts in many places at many times. Empty classrooms, the sacristy, the small school chapel, the nurse's office, the rectory, all become sexualized spaces. He tells your parents he'd like to take you to a summer place at the beach, and they're relieved not to have to worry about you. There, the abuse, during which you are always blindfolded, meshes with fishing expeditions, movies, riding the ocean waves, clam digging, and other activities that a lonely, only child living in a city apartment building with drunk and arguing parents finds amazing. That fun and adventure fills your days. Your nights, on the other hand, find Father Bill rubbing his penis between your buttocks, caressing and sucking on your now erect penis, tongue-kissing you, and pushing your blindfolded face onto his penis. You clench your teeth tightly, and as far as you can remember, never let him get inside your mouth. It's a small but important act of defiance and self-protection. Imagine. You are now 11, and pubertal acne is spurting on your face. On the first day of 6th grade, Father Bill pulls you into a storage room, and as he tries to kiss you, he tells you that your badness is coming out all over your face. This time you push him off and run. He never touches you again. Can you imagine the life of this young boy from 8 to 11, and afterwards? He never spoke of the abuse until earlier this year. At that point, he read in the paper that Father Bill had been accused of sexually molesting boys 30 years ago in another parish. Although removed from ministry, Father Bill denied all the charges and was quoted in the paper as saying that he was being scapegoated in the church scandal and had never even known his accusers when they were boys. At that point, my patient contacted other men that he suspected had been molested by Father Bill in their parish, and a number of them went to the local papers with their stories. My patient is not suing anyone, nor does he plan on suing anyone. He does say the following: "It is something that I have thought about every day of my life, yet have always been far too ashamed to talk about. I'm still ashamed. After reading Father Bill's denials in the paper, though, I decided I couldn't hide my story any longer. I was robbed of my youth and my faith at a very young age. If I can prevent this from happening to other children, then perhaps I'm on the right track. I'm not a practicing Catholic, and I certainly don't need the Catholic Church teaching my children morals and values and right from wrong. In fact, it will probably be years before I have to answer the question, 'Hey, Daddy, what's a priest?' Can you imagine?" As I turn now to a delineation of the role of the hierarchy in the criminal cover-up of crime, try to remember my patient. His suffering is the experiential reality that imbues all that follows here with any real meaning. The hierarchical organization of the Catholic Church incorporates traditions, principles, and structures that almost inevitably led to the covering up of sexual abuse by its priests. Both liberal or progressive theologians like Richard McBrien of Notre Dame and conservative theologians like George Weigel agree that, although the office of bishop is intended to be a ministry, not a promotion or status symbol, it has become associated as much with velvet-draped chanceries, chauffeured limousines, fine wine, and great deference as with the pastoral care of priests and faithful in a diocesan locale. Their comments suggest that too many members of the hierarchy, comparable in status to yesterday's Pharisees, have lost track of Christ's admonition in Luke. But woe to you, Pharisees, for you tithe mint and rue and herbs of all kinds, and neglect justice and the love of God. It is these you ought to have practiced without neglecting the others. Woe to you, Pharisees, for you love to have the seat of honor in the synagogues and to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces. Woe to you, for you are like unmarked graves, and people walk over them without realizing it. In addition, writers like Father Donald Cousins, former priest and psychologist Eugene Kennedy, Richard McBrien, Commonweal editor Margaret Steinfels, and Gary Wills all maintain that under John Paul II, there has been a movement to restore the monarchical structure of the Church to what it was prior to Vatican II. Let us look then at some features of this monarchy. First, there is centralized power. The familiar adage, power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely, was coined by Lord Acton in reference to the Renaissance popes. Perhaps the last monarchy still operating within a medieval organizational structure, the Catholic Church, and the Church, especially under this long-running papacy, has been most critical of certain democracies, especially Western ones, that John Paul perceives as fusing democratic freedoms with ethical relativism to the moral detriment of society. Within the monarchy of this Church, cardinals are princes and the bishops are lords. Unlike the early days of Christianity, during which bishops were accountable to their communities, members of today's hierarchy answer only to the Pope. Clerical leaders chosen during the reign of John Paul II all have passed litmus tests of adherence to conservative orthodoxy, particularly regarding teachings about gender and sexuality, birth control, abortion, homosexuality, masturbation, premarital sex, divorce, mandatory celibacy, and the ordination of women. The Pope's stance on these issues is easily communicated. Don't do any of them, don't even talk about any of them, don't even think about doing any of them. The current crop of American bishops and cardinals all have advanced their careers by bending to the will of the Pope, especially on these topics. They do not disagree with him, and they cannot allow dissent within the ranks of their diocese. They know that dissent, as defined by this Pope, is dangerous. During his papacy, theologians and others determined by John Paul and the Vatican to be in dissent from church teachings have been silenced by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith through processes experienced as humiliating by those censored. Moral theologian Bernard Herring was investigated and silenced for speculating about the possibility of ordaining women to the priesthood. Herring, who had been persecuted by the Nazis earlier in life, said, quote, "I would prefer Hitler's court to another papal interrogation. Hitler's trials certainly were more dangerous, but they were not an offense to my honor," end quote. In some ways, it is easy for the bishops to bend to what is ordered, explicitly and implicitly, by the Pope and other Vatican officials. In a very real way, many American bishops in power from the 1950s to today never lived as adult men in the democratic culture of the United States. Rather, they lived in the church. Entering high school seminaries at the ages of 13, 14, or 15, their only significant lived experience was within an ecclesiastically governed state from which they peered out at their host country. They had neither an internalized psychological template nor any in vivo experience with shared authority, consensual decision-making, or the negotiation of conflicting viewpoints, at least on any subjects considered important to the teachings of the Church. They lived their adult lives taking orders until they earned the right to give them. Somewhat understandably, they expect to receive the kind of deference they spent decades extending to those above them. Deference that, for some, included covering up their own bishop's sexual peccadillos. Even as the sexual abuse scandal grew tentacles around chanceries, strangling the bishop's claim to any moral authority, especially on issues of sexuality, most bishops literally could not imagine sharing authority. Not only would it be unfamiliar, it would be wrong. It could also be dangerous to one's career, especially under a pope who has insisted on unquestioning submission to his own will. The seemingly paradoxical flip side of the centralized institutional power coin was the bishop's tendency to rely on diocesan lawyers, insurance companies, and sometimes questionable treatment centers to direct their handling of the sexual abuse crisis. As Eugene Kennedy put it so eloquently, too many bishops ceded authority while maintaining authoritarianism, a stance that helped a crisis develop into a scandal. In selecting experts, the hierarchy took an insular approach. They usually chose from their own, from those known by their own, or from those who had worked with them before. For example, in 1996, the Ad Hoc Committee on Sexual Abuse of the United States Conference on Catholic Bishops recommended to the bishops 13 articles on various aspects of the sexual abuse crisis. Not one was written by a widely accepted expert on the research, theory, or treatment of sexual abuse victims or offenders. Of the 13, 8 were written by priests and/or employees of the church. None was written by a woman. So insular were the leaders of the church that they turned usually to the safely familiar for help, even when the qualifications of the familiar were questionable. Consciously or unconsciously, the bishops selected advisors who, by station or through experience, would come to them in deference and respect. These selections supported rather than challenged the hierarchy's internalized configurations of self and other at a time when those psychological structures were being assailed by forces outside the walls of the chanceries. In some ways, the bishops resembled Lyndon Johnson, whose presidency fell in part because he continued to turn to advisors like General Westmoreland for advice about the Vietnam War, long after it should have been clear to him that those experts neither could help him resolve the war nor respond pastorally to the country's disaffected. Centralized power and reliance on user-friendly experts intersected with a deeply ingrained commitment to avoid at almost any cost bringing scandal to the church. For too long, too many of the hierarchy tried to conceal rather than openly portray and confront the burgeoning sexual abuse crisis, in the end only scandalizing the church even more. The needles on their moral compasses spun, now this way, now that, as pastoral love and mature authority washed into a secular gutter clogged with lawsuits, secret settlements, half-truths, faulty memories, and outright lies. More and more, the American bishops acted like branch managers for a multinational religious corporation, hiding cooked books and single-mindedly focusing on asset protection rather than pastorally attending to their brother priests and suffering faithful. The bishops, of course, also are executives of corporations that deliver the concretized programs involved in pastoral care. Even in the best of times, their dual roles sometimes engender deeply conflicting agendas. At times of crisis, the incompatibility of their corporate and ministerial personae challenges the bishop's ability to hold in mind simultaneously their divergent responsibilities and cares. To achieve that balance, always privileging pastoral duties, however, is a bishop's job. Had the bishops reacted to the sexual abuse crisis pastorally from the beginning, they would have personally engaged with members of each constituency affected by the scandal. Caringly, mindfully, with advice from consultants chosen for their competence rather than their orthodoxy or familiarity, in consultation with each other, with deep and ongoing reflection, they would have ministered to each individual and group according to their particular needs, considered in relationship to the needs of the whole faith community. Victims and their families would have been embraced lovingly as sufferers, rather than suspiciously distanced as grasping threats to the family jewels. Even after counseling was arranged and/or financial redress negotiated, a pastoral bishop would regularly keep in touch with victims and survivors to communicate his ongoing concern and care. An abusing priest would not mindlessly be shuffled off to a treatment center or to another parish. Nor would he suddenly discover from Edward Cardinal Egan and the Vatican that rather than serving his bishop as a brother priest through a relationally based contract, he merely was engaged legally as an independent contractor, agreeing to obey a bishop who had no responsibility for him or his actions. Even after a priest was jailed, hospitalized, dismissed from ministry, or laicized, a pastoral bishop would feel a responsibility to continue to communicate with his priest, a man recognized by the bishop to be in deep and ongoing need of ministry. For example, Archbishop John Favalora annually visits a seminarian classmate serving a life sentence for raping an 8-year-old boy. Although criticized by victims groups for what they perceive to be lopsided concern for an abuser, Favalora says, quote, "Everyone, no matter what the circumstances, is entitled to experience the healing touch of Jesus." Finally, pastoral bishops would discourage even falsely accused priests from launching costly slander countersuits likely to discourage other victims from coming forward, but rather would help priests clear their names non-combatively. Pastoral bishops would have met personally with the decent, deeply demoralized priests in their diocese. He would have met with them and appropriate consultants to map out responses to false allegations, lest good priests feel abandoned, forced into an isolated corner and befriended only by attorneys willing to sue someone. Further, a pastoral bishop would have encouraged his priests to meet regularly with each other for support and reflection. He would not refuse to meet with his priests in peer councils and discussion groups, as did Bernard Cardinal Law. Pastoral bishops would have trudged personally to every parish in their diocese to be present to the laity, to recognize their doubt and pain, and to listen abundantly and to speak truthfully. Pastoral bishops would not have relied on carefully crafted letters read at Mass by priests as dismayed by the crisis as their parishioners to communicate with the laity. One local pastor in my home county in New York received a letter about the burgeoning scandal from Cardinal Egan to be read at Mass last May. Along with the letter were instructions from the Cardinal forbidding priests to engage in any discussion with the laity about the contents of the letter. Instructions this particular pastor pastorally ignored. As corporate executives determined to lead their entities with integrity, pastoral bishops would have retained authority over decisions ostensibly made to protect the church, insisting that the church as mystery and people of God take priority over the church as institution. They would have presented the pastorally privileged plan they felt spiritually and morally bound to follow, and charged their staffs and consultants to figure out how it could be made to work. In so doing, they would have recognized that legally defensible strategies might be morally unacceptable to pursue when a church has been complicit in hurting so very many souls. As conservative theologian George Weigel put it, quote, "A bishop whose lawyers advise him not to meet with a victim needs different lawyers. Lawyers who understand what a bishop is and who have the legal wit and skill to make sure when the bishop exercises genuine pastoral care and responsibility, he does not end up compromising his legal position or the diocese." Perhaps more important, Jesus of Nazareth says in Matthew, "Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are on the way to court with him, or your accuser may hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the guard, and you will be thrown in prison. Truly I tell you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your coat, give your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the 2nd mile. Give to everyone who begs from you, and do not refuse anyone who wants to borrow from you. I certainly think that Bishop Richard Lennon and any other bishop following legal strategies similar to his has a moral and pastoral obligation to look into a television camera and cite to the faithful the scriptural passages authorizing him to re-victimize the already broken by deposing therapists contracted by the Archdiocese to, quote, heal the Church's victims, and to pursue other utterly legal, utterly hardball, and utterly, in my opinion, immoral tactics. Long before schools are closed and the poor neglected, there are golden chalices and patens, gorgeous antiques and mansions, wonderful art, sterling silver diningware, fine crystal, well-stocked wine cellars, and silk and satin vestments that could be auctioned off or sold to meet some of the financial liabilities stemming from the sexual abuse cases. Would it not be appropriate, given the harm done to the Church's children and young people by its priests and religious, to celebrate Mass in simple structures, even in homes like in the early days of the Church, with the Eucharist served on paper plates and Dixie cups, by priests clad in unadorned linen, before choosing metaphorically to pin victims to the courtroom floor and shove the Church's legal phallus into them once again? In order for the American bishops to function first as pastors, however, it was essential that they experience themselves as recognized and supported by the papacy and by each other. Creative thought, imagination, openness to a wide range of possibility, and a willingness to take risks flourish only within organizational cultures that invite and even insist on those managerial qualities. The American bishops were deprived of that. First, despite ample evidence that the sexual abuse of minors by priests and the violation of celibacy within adult sexual relationships are worldwide phenomena, the Vatican insisted that sexual abuse was a peculiarly American problem. Rather than responding pastorally to the bishops, the Vatican made it clear to them that the American hierarchy had to solve this problem, their problem, on their own. Further, the Pope and other Vatican officials implicitly conveyed that the bishops must address the crisis without capitulating to the demands of the media, civil authorities, or a decadently sexualized modern public. As Kennedy beautifully describes it, the American bishops found themselves jammed between the rock of Peter and a hard place, caught between incompatible demands of their higher hierarchy and the various voices of America. This was an organizational formula for paralysis, abdication of accountability, and defensive scapegoating, for unconsciously doing unto others what was being done to them, rather than for pastoral creativity and original problem solving. Under these organizational conditions, it is little wonder that so many of the American hierarchy failed for so long and continue to fail in too many cases to respond effectively in either their corporate or pastoral roles to the sexual abuse scandal. Too many members of the American hierarchy simply were not up to the task. They were also badly out of touch with postmodern America. At the beginning of the 21st century, Western intellectual life was marked by ongoing exegesis of postmodern thought. Particularly in the relevant areas of gender, sexuality, and power and authority, postmodernists challenged fixed categories and static power structures, favoring instead fluidity and ever-shifting social construction of relationships, organization, and states of self. As modernity had destabilized the certainty of faith, postmodernism unsettled the certainty and stability of science. Meanwhile, back at the Vatican, the papal wars on modernity, energetically suspended by Pope John XXIII and more ambivalently by his successor Paul VI, were at least partially reopened by John Paul II and especially extended to include postmodernism. Pius X, who reigned from 1903 to 1914, issued the papal encyclical Pascendi Dominici Gregis in 1907. It defined the Catholic Church's relationship with modernity until Vatican II. Launching a vitriolic attack on modernity as it applied to theological conceptualization and views of the institutional church, Pascendi directed the bishops to ban modernist works from seminaries, to forbid the faithful on pain of excommunication from reading modern writers, and to prohibit clergy from meeting in groups lest modern ideas infect discussions. Eventually, every priest was required to take an oath against modernism. The oath was not discontinued until 1967. Kennedy describes the Church's savage attack on modernity and on the potential intellectual potency of its members, especially its clergy, as a hierarchically driven defensive emasculation, a campaign to render the priesthood docile as well as doctrinally pure and unquestioning. Pascendi, it also seems to me, both feminized in the traditional sense and infantilized its priests. To be a good priest, a man had to be utterly receptive, passively opening up to doctrinal feedings pumped from the breast of Holy Mother Church. At the same time, penetration was the purview of the papacy. The papal phallus alone was authorized to fill the waiting mental wombs of clergy, delivering only seeds of knowledge deemed by the Vatican to be synchronous with traditional Catholic teachings. Pope John XXIII, and with less enthusiasm his successor Paul VI, opened the Church up to the possibilities, the spiritual possibilities offered by the modern world. In his stirring 1963 encyclical Pacem in Terris, Pope John welcomed the world into the Church, who he in turn prodded into the world. Quote, that a marvelous order predominates in the world of living beings and in the forces of nature is the plain lesson which the progress of modern research and the discovery of technology teaches us. Far from banning the study of modern ideas, Paul VI in Gaudium et Spes urged bishops to establish, quote, dialogue with the world and with men of all shades of opinion, end quote. And he encouraged seminary and university faculties to, quote, collaborate with men versed in other sciences, end quote. Further, Gaudium et Spes recognized that effective pastoral care could require clergy to turn to, quote, the social sciences, especially psychology and sociology, so that the faithful may be brought to a more adequate and mature life of faith, end quote. Vatican II threw open the doors of the Church, of the Catholic Church, to science, social science, and technology. Catholics, even priests, could study modern subjects, admonished only to integrate them into their faith, and in turn to bring their faith to their pursuits. Clergy and religious were encouraged to be as much in the world as out of it, and even began to look more like their fellow human beings, as priests exchanged cassocks for trousers, and nuns threw off their veils and wimples. It was thus stunning to the Catholic community when in 1968, Paul VI slammed shut the doors of the Church on artificial contraception. Despite the recommendations of a 58-member papal commission, mandated to study birth control and overwhelmingly in favor of changing the teaching of the Church on contraception, Paul could not bring himself to suggest that past teachings, therefore, had been in error. His 1968 encyclical Humanae Vitae reasserted the ban on artificial contraception and instructed bishops and priests to get behind it in their ministries. The rhythm method of birth control, the efficacy of which many Irish Catholic mothers of 10 would be happy to discuss, was the only allowed route to family planning. That sex was the one topic absolutely closed for collegial discussion and the influence of modern thought had been demonstrated the year before in 1967 when Paul issued Sacerdotalis Celibatus, I'm sorry, I had 4 years of Latin, but that was 30 years ago, an encyclical forbidding synods of bishops even to discuss allowing priests to marry. Apparently, sex was the one area of life in which Catholics were to remain dissociated from modern developments in social science and technology, as well as from their own consciences. What hope there was that Paul's successor would reopen dialogue about the magisterium, especially regarding matters of morality and modernity, was dashed by John Paul II. Despite his worldwide popularity and admirable extension of the papal hand to Catholics and non-Catholics alike across the world, Pope John Paul II has been a very conservative pope. Some, like Kennedy, McBrien, and Wills, say that his agenda has been to restore much church policy and practice to pre-conciliar states. More conservative theologians like Richard John Newhouse and George Weigel argue that John Paul legitimately has corrected errors enacted by post-conciliar liberals, distorting the letter and spirit of Vatican II. Either way, the Pope is a man deeply distrustful of some aspects of modernity, the major tenets of postmodernism, and Western democracies he judges deadened by enslavement to hypersexuality. Unlike the optimistic and basically trusting John the 23rd, John Paul emphasizes that individual conscience must submit to objective truth, which in matters of morality and more especially sexuality is to be found within the error-free magisterium. Teachers of theologically related subjects in Catholic institutions are expected once more to sign statements of loyalty to official Catholic teachings, an oath that prevents them from discussing in class or writing about alternative perspectives on various issues. Everything old, it seems, is new again. Whatever his theological and political agenda for the Church, perhaps one can detect in Pope John Paul II, a psychologically familiar, unconscious identification with his own aggressors. As a Polish prelate, he labored long and very courageously to oust totalitarian regimes from his country. As Pope, however, he has established himself as a clerical autocrat, at least in terms of acceptable ideas, coming down hard on any disagreement with or dissent from what he deems to be the truth, and extending the range of teachings considered to be irrefutable. His bishops have been chosen for their doctrinal purity as much as communist bureaucrats were chosen for their allegiance to the party line. And as the communists banished dissenters to the Gulag, John Paul, too, has silenced theologians deemed by him to be out of step with official teachings, forcing them to stop teaching and publishing. Critics of the Pope have been labeled Pope bashers, and their careers have been jeopardized, fates symbolically akin to those of communist officials who suddenly disappeared from public view after drifting too far away from dogma in a speech or meeting. For some American bishops, John Paul's approach to things, including his skepticism about modernity and postmodernism, however, may have been comfortingly familiar. Most American bishops running dioceses from the 1950s forward, the period of time most involved in the current cover-up, were ordained in pre-conciliar times. Their priestly formation, often beginning in early adolescence, was conducted in seminaries under the sway of Pascendi. From boyhood on, these men were discouraged from reading the intellectual ideas of their times and were endowed with deep skepticism, even contempt for anything modern. All ordained prior to 1967, therefore the vast majority of them took the oath against modernism. This internalized mistrust of empiricism and psychological and biological conceptualizations of personality, combined with the devaluing of many aspects of modernity and almost all of postmodernism coming out of Rome, made it highly unlikely that the bishops would access hard and social scientific resources to deepen their understanding of sexual abuse. Prior to the mid-1980s, of course, there was virtually no empirical, theoretical, or clinical literature regarding early sexual trauma. As that body of knowledge developed exponentially after 1984, however, too many American bishops remained and are still ignorant or skeptical about it. For example, when I addressed the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops on the long-term consequences of sexual abuse, it was gratifying but also shocking that so many bishops personally thanked me for helping them appreciate sexual trauma from the experience of minor victims and adult survivors for the first time. Given the amount of time, I remember one cardinal said he had spent 40% of the preceding year on this topic. Given the amount of time most bishops had been devoting to the sexual abuse scandal, it was surprising to sense their continued genuine or studied naivete about it. The ecclesiastical unfamiliarity with and fear of potentially disruptive modern and postmodern ideas instilled in most bishops early on and reinforced by John Paul intersected with the hierarchy's tendency to turn mostly to their own, quote, experts to produce an American hierarchy woefully lacking in empirical, theoretical, and clinical data essential for effectively responding to abusing priests and victims and survivors. In this way, the bishops were akin to late 20th century architects and building engineers trying to design a skyscraper on draft boards and using slide rules rather than turning to a CAD CAM. The results were not structurally sound. Another major problem facing bishops in the second half of the 20th century was the ever-growing shortage of priests. For the past 50 years, the bishops have been faced with a declining population of clergy, the permanence and likely exacerbation of which is denied by the Vatican and by many bishops themselves. Some Vatican statements about the temporary and reparable nature of the priest shortage have been disconcertingly similar to those recently made by the Iraqi Minister of Information, stating definitively that there were no Americans in Baghdad and Saddam Hussein Airport was open for business. Although many priests resigned in order to marry, for example, discussions among bishops about married priests and/or the even more controversial ordination of women simply were forbidden. The only options acceptable to the Vatican, and thus perforce to bishops, were to construct more enthusiastic recruitment campaigns and to increase the volume and fervency of prayers for vocations. It was the classic double bind. The bishops knew in their hearts that the priest shortage was likely to get worse, not better. Their parents, Holy Mother Church and the Holy Father, however, insisted that what the bishops saw year after year did not exist or could be changed through traditional approaches. A bishop speaking the truth was likely to lose this love of his spiritual parents and might lose his job as well. So in order to survive, he had to join in the denial or at least turn a blind eye to it. Certainly a bishop in this situation might consciously or unconsciously ordain priests about whom doubts were expressed in the seminary and/or do everything possible to keep his numbers up by recycling priests about whom sexual abuse claims had been made, thus contributing to what eventually would become the sexual abuse scandal. Finally, the bishop's heartfelt commitment to forgiveness and the possibility for personal conversion entered into the cover-up. An unbelievably large number of sexually abusive priests admitted their offenses when confronted by their bishops with accusations made about them. Believing profoundly, they asked for forgiveness and promised that they would sin no more. Believing profoundly in a person's ability to redeem himself, a bishop often took a priest at his word and arranged for him to start again somewhere else, perhaps after evaluation and treatment at a church-operated facility likely to give the priest a positive prognosis. Discernible in the aphorism that God never sent a temptation without also transmitting the grace to fight it, a bishop's deeply held faith in the transformative power of the sacrament of penance coexisted with all the other sociocultural and political elements described here to exacerbate the incidence of sexual abuse by priests, the mismanagement of abusing priests, the apparent lack of compassion for victims, and the reactions of victims who came forward only to learn that father had been abusing children or adolescents for years. Almost every writer addressing the sexual abuse scandal in the Catholic Church places the bulk of the blame for its depth and breadth and cost, financial, emotional, spiritual, onto the shoulders of the American bishops. For 40 years, they have, with notable exceptions, ranged in appearance from dishonest and nasty to hapless and studiously naive. While it is true that they have been too often exceptional, mostly for unflaggingly doing absolutely the wrong thing almost every single step of the way, it is too simple to scapegoat them as the real or only villains in the scandals. In fact, the combinative power of the sociocultural, political, and faith-based factors considered here make clear the almost certain inevitability of their actions. While understanding the cultural and psychological milieu in which American bishops have lived is not exculpatory of their criminal acts of omission and commission, it is important to view the scandal and its participants through a lens offering a three-dimensional model of sexual abuse in the church. In my book and in other papers, I'll apply the same kind of multiple perspective to rank and file priests, abusing priests, religious women, laity, and the denizens of the Vatican. As I have said at every meeting like this, it has been and continues to be an enormous grace for me to participate in this dialogue about the church scandal. I thank you for listening abundantly to a very long paper. Other questions?
You had written to Bishop Lynne. Has he responded to it? I assume I enjoyed it, but...
He said that, wanted to know if Bishop Lynne had responded to the letter I sent about deposing therapists, and he has not. Yes?
Do you have any comments or opinions on the response of, how should I say, in your comments, the sexual abuse is in all cultures, not just our church. And that said, do you not think that men and women, all of us, have to wake up? That I guess I wonder, everything you said, of course, is true. So what do we do? I don't want to die if I'm for change and already dead as a teacher. So do you have any thoughts of how people could stop banging their head against this hierarchy and build a community?
You have to talk to theologians about that, not psychologists. I don't. I mean, I really don't. I think people... Yeah, I do. I think I've consulted a number of times with some of the religious orders, and I think that they are doing a much different kind of job than the diocesan priests are. I think, unfortunately, ultimately, in the diocese, it comes down to money. And withholding money from the diocese and giving it to things like Voice of the Faithful is probably the only way to have a significant basis of power. Yes?
Nothing seems to be changing until the year. We have accused priests now in Boston, it's not moving. We have priests who simply sued California to say, every indication I see out there is that the game plan as usual is continuing to present. So it's like, in the wagon that you circle the entire So, short of just absolute withholding money and having multi-billion-dollar civil settlements and rebirth through poverty in the future. Is there any hope or any action you see out there to help people?
I think if it happens at all, it's going to take a long time. And I think that the metaphor that I've used elsewhere is that you have to think of it almost like a feudal village, and the baker goes to the feudal lord and says, "Your stepson raped my daughter." And the feudal lord may give the baker the contract for bread for the castle for a year, or he may send a new horse, and he may even send his stepson out, of the village for a little while. But he doesn't, at some fundamental level, he doesn't care.
Right, in that analogy, it may leave the village or he overthrows the
I mean, again, I think it's more, those kind of questions are more for theologians and church historians and not for a psychoanalyst from New York. Yes?
I have a question on the socio-political or psychological piece of this related to the persistent drumbeat. It's all about gay priests and homosexuality over and over. And also, I mean, I don't think it's any secret we have more than a few very good gay priests of integrity as we have many straight priests of integrity. But the lay in particular, from what I can see, are very uncomfortable of saying this publicly to support priests who happen to be gay because of the conflation and all of these other idiotic things. What is your sense of how homosexuality does or does not, a gay priest culture, play into this, and what can the laity do to free or liberate this church from this kind of...
I actually think there's some hopefulness there. First of all, there is absolutely no correlation whatsoever between sexual orientation and sexual abuse. And in fact, all other things being equal, a child is a heck of a lot safer with a homosexual man than with a heterosexual man. Homosexual men, mature, grown-up homosexual men choose other grown-up homosexual men for partners, not children. And there are at least some experts that have researched offenders that feel that pedophilia and ephebophilia is another sexual orientation. It's neither homosexual nor heterosexual. It has to do with seeking immature sexual objects to be with. So there's no correlation whatsoever, and I think it's been, a really one of the most unjust and immoral responses to the scandal. And the hopeful thing is that there was apparently, within the last week or so, a conference on pedophilia at the Vatican, and all the experts said the same thing, and it looks like it's at least possible that the Vatican will not issue the ban on ordaining gay priests that they were contemplating. So, I think the other issues of, whether a priesthood that is gay disproportionately from the rest of the culture is a problem or not is completely separate from this scandal. There's just no correlation, none, zero, period. Yes? Well, you're next. I think that were priests attracted to seminaries because of homosexual subcultures? I think that there are some young men who are attracted to the priesthood because they were psychosexually immature, period. Whether they were heterosexual or homosexual or bisexual, or they didn't know what they were. It was a place to put that anxiety somewhere else and not have to deal with it and not have to work with it. And certainly in the older models of formation, it just was off the table as an issue for discussion. So I think it's the immaturity, not the sexual orientation, that's the problem. Yes, you were next.
In your experience, do you see any possibility of true accountability of the hierarchy?
I can't hear you. Can you speak a little louder?
In your experience, do you see any possibility of true accountability out of the hierarchy? And if you do not see that, is our only option really leaving the institution and practicing our faith privately?
Again, I feel like that's not a question where It's out of my area of expertise, and my ethics board says I'm not supposed to practice outside my area of expertise. I think those are questions that are great for discussion groups and for people to think about. But in terms of the accountability, I just don't know. I think there are certainly some bishops who have experienced a conversion and really believe that wrong was done and want to help the victims. I think overall, the bishops didn't stop covering all this up because they got together and decided that evil was being done. They stopped covering it up because they were forced to, because they were sued and it's been in the newspapers and people have been kicking them in the teeth about it. So I think, I am afraid that in many cases, if it all went away tomorrow, it would be business as usual. Mary Lou.
Precisely within your area of expertise, even though it's in the contradiction of what you just said, would there be any possibility, or has there been, of people who've done research like yourself, presenting that the cadre of folks we still have left, there's not many of them in their department, but I think the people like Ralph Martinez, I believe, and others of that era, who are beyond the promotional concerns of the punitive possibilities of the Gloria at this point, who could be an audience for and then spokespersons for the kind of research that you have done.
Yeah, I don't know. I think the problem is there have been 3 different times that research has been proposed at the USCCB and even funded. There was Leslie Lowstein from the Institute for Living in Hartford proposed a very good study on priestly sexuality, got NIH funding, it was good to go, and then the USCCB killed it. And they killed it because they said what the findings might increase their liability in the legal system. So I think they know, they're afraid of what they're going to find out, and they don't want to find it out, and so they're not going to allow competent, valid, generalizable research to be done anytime soon. And that, more than anything, is what's needed. And they could provide, and one absolutely concrete way of the church providing reparation is to allow that kind of research to be done and to facilitate it. They have a universe of priests who have abused, who they couldn't force to participate, but they certainly could encourage to participate. They know where victims are. They can encourage victims, especially research on male victims, which is still not at the level that it is for female victims of sexual abuse in general, and they just won't do it. At least now. Yes? I mean, I think it's the same when the wider society has been confronted by sexual abuse. I mean, the good news and the bad news is that in many ways the church has responded no better or worse than any other segment of society. Nobody wants to know, because I think part of it is that to really acknowledge that this happens, and happens frequently in families and schools and camps and the church, forces each of us to examine our own capacity to do evil and to live with evil. And I think most people don't want to look at that and to stand in it. So it's easier to dissociate it and to, put it over there somewhere. It's not that bad. They asked for it. It's like Cardinal George saying, well, a 17-year-old girl who had a couple of drinks with the priest is, people will do almost anything to make it into something other than what it is. Yes. I can't hear you. I'm sorry.
Are there ways that you integrate this broader context of the sexual abuse into the treatment itself?
You mean what I talked about tonight? I mean, not usually. She asked me if I can integrate sort of the broader context of abuse working with victims. And yeah, I mean, the answer is, it's such a cop-out, but it's the real answer. It depends. It depends on the patient and where they are in treatment and what kind of issues they're bringing up, and you know, whether it's used defensively or whether it's used progressively. It just depends. I mean, I think an easy example is when a father-daughter incest survivor has learned that her mother also was an incest survivor, so that it doesn't excuse the mother's lack of protectiveness, but it provides a context that, okay, something like that. Great. When I presented to some Jesuits in New York, one had just come back from Rome, and he said that essentially there isn't a pope right now, that one day he's clear and lucid, the next day he's sitting in his chair drooling. And I think that, you know, as an effective presence, we're popeless right now. Whether that means we're also hopeless, I don't know. Yes?
Not to diminish sexual violation in any way, that was the subtext of the real problem, which essentially is the problem of power, and the problem of power being held by virtue of being denied education. All my life I was denied education around the nature of church and the nature of the divine power, which is servant of the servant. That continued to take place 50 years ago. We still don't know. We're not being taught. We're being taught the church in terms of hierarchy, so that sexuality was allowed to go on because they had the power to allow it, and they expect us to still accept that. So power is the basic problem we're addressing, and we'll forever address it until we understand the nature of church.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
Being taught that until a lot of that can be addressed that, but why don't we stop it?
I think that's right. Arthur. Can you just speak a little louder? I have an air conditioner behind me.
I'd like to comment on what Paul Ryder said earlier about the same small group of people showing up, and the vast majority of Catholics being inert and not seemingly not caring. I think that one of the issues that activists haven't wanted to look at perhaps that really needs to be looked at is, there's a couple of perpetrators in the crowd who are going to church every Sunday. You can't have no interest in seeing this resolved in a known way for the victims, and that's an issue that I think is not being addressed. Maybe the people in your situation in your profession can begin to address that. Because I often wonder when I'm standing outside the cathedral or demonstration in some furious good Catholic who's buying me. This is something incredibly powerful.
Yeah, I think the thing is, though, that it's true in any group. If you go to a Mets game or you go to, you can take roughly 6% of men and they're perpetrators. So I don't think it's peculiar, and it provides a force for denial and dissociation throughout society. And actually, I had the dean of my doctoral program, who's one of the good guys and was on my dissertation defense. Every year, he would teach an ethics class, and he'd say something about how the numbers of victims in the country are exaggerated, because the numbers keep coming up and coming up and coming up, that a third of all women and up to a fourth of all men have been sexually abused before the age of 18. And I would go upstairs and I would say, "George, what are you doing?" And I would see the fog clear from his eyes, and he would kind of slump, and he'd say, "Mary Gail, I don't want to look out there and see every third woman and know that she was abused, and even more than that, if I know that many victims, I know perpetrators, and I don't want to think about the fact that maybe I've played poker on Friday nights with a perpetrator." So I think it's a societal attitude, and he's one of the good guys. So.
Lawyers bringing in someone with false memory syndrome, gang, to testify in case.
I think it's consistent with the tactics they're using. And Elizabeth Loftus had to resign from the American Psychological Association days before a complaint was lodged against her for her methodological methods. She was using research assistants' children as her research subjects, which you would never get past a human subjects committee meeting at Adelphi anyway, and she resigned rather than be investigated. So I think it's just consistent with what they're doing.
Because it's my sense that a lot of the power behind that movement and that person is perpetrated on, if not money.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, but yeah, it's consistent with the hardball tactics they're using. Yes.
I may have misheard this, but in the sense that you thought all people in the church structure, including lay people, perhaps are part of this problem. Is that?
Yeah.
I mean, in the Boston Archdiocese, for example, it seems to me, in following this more than a year now, that there were very vigilant lay women, religious mothers, who were on top of this to a certain extent. And I don't know what more you or anyone
Well, what I'm saying is I think that especially years ago, even if there were, why do I think that the laity bear some responsibility for the enabling of this? And I think that there was such an ingrained transference, if you will, or idealization of priests that, like my husband said, when he was in high school, he just knew that he should stay away from one of the priests in his parish. He doesn't even remember how he knew. He just knew, whether someone said or they rolled their eyes or whatnot. I think people knew, and certainly rectory housekeepers, where men were bringing kids, upstairs into the bedrooms, nuns or lay teachers, where Susie or Johnny were being taken out of the classroom every week by a priest. They knew. Maybe they didn't let themselves know. Let themselves know that they knew. But there were signs that were ignored, and I think there were lots of reasons for that. And that it's part of the solution to make sure that not just the hierarchy gets it together, but that we all are willing to have a voice when we think something is awry.
But what would that mean with the civil lay in terms of ongoing?
Well, it would mean if a housekeeper saw Father Bill taking a kid up to the bedroom, that she'd make a phone call to the kid's parents, to the bishop, to whoever, and say, maybe nothing's going on, but this is a little weird, and I think someone should look into it. I think we're getting out of time. Yes.
You haven't given us too much hope tonight. Do you feel that because what you're obviously saying, and particularly saying strongly,
Oh, gee, I hope not. I mean, I think the hope lies in greater participation by the laity and greater accountability and I think, ultimately it'll be a new pope, that nothing's going to happen under this pope, and who knows what the next one will be. That this pope has appointed most of the electors, but history says that there's surprises. It's like the Supreme Court. The president thinks he's getting one thing and he gets something quite different. John the 23rd was supposed to just keep the seat of Peter warm. So you just don't know. But I think it has to be pushing from below, but it's got to come from above at some point. Yes?
I would ask you in your field, maybe you could write about the whole idea of giving up the good mother. Which one of us would want to give up our holy mother and believe she's human? I think that's the fixing for a lot of our own lethargy. We just don't want to believe our holy mother could be so bloody sinful.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point.
Continue with that.
I think that's a good point. Yes?
I just wanted to say a word about the survivor victims some of us have met and worked with this year. And I think for some of us that's been a tremendously hopeful part of this, to understand their suffering, to open our eyes. And some of us think that they're the modern prophets. And I think there's a way in which sometimes we count on them too much, and we need to do a lot of this ourselves. But for all of us here who have heard the survivors speak and who have tried to work side by side, I want to say that that's been very, very important, and we appreciate what they've been able to do to teach us.
I think that's a good point, and I do think consciousness is being raised. I gave 3 Advent lectures at a local parish, and I talked about sexual abuse in the wider society. And I asked the 50 or so people that were there, had they ever heard those numbers before? And they said no. And I said, before the church scandal, would you have believed those numbers? And they said no. And now they do. So it's sort of, the law of unforeseen consequences, but there can be good that comes out of this, even if it's not first or foremost for the church, just in terms of attitudes in the wider society about child sexual abuse. Okay, okay, we got 2 more minutes.